Good evening or good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the International Journal of Islamic Architecture's inaugural webinar for its new section called the Dialogue Series. And so this is a new section in the journal itself, but it starts with a sort of an online webinar that will be shared on the website before we actually publish it in the journal itself. My name is Hala Auji. I'm an assistant editor with the journal, and I'm also an assistant professor of Islamic art at the American University in Beirut. I'm delighted to be hosting this first installment of the series. As I said, this is sort of an annual seminar that brings together scholars and practitioners from across varied disciplines for a discussion of contemporary critical issues that really try to interrogate the boundaries between architecture, art, anthropology, archaeology, and history. The webinar is being recorded, just so that you know again. And as I said, I will be sharing on social media and in other platforms once that actually happens. For today's session on ruins, the contemporary politics of heritage preservation and reconstruction, I'm joined by the video artists and filmmakers Ali Cherri, who works between Beirut and Paris, and Panos Aprahamian, who works mostly in Beirut. And we're going to have a conversation on the intersections between video art, film, and architectural preservation and questions of heritage in relationship to regions like Syria, Palestine, Iraq, the Gulf, and Artsakh. Ali is a video artist and a visual artist, and he works with drawing, film, installation, performance, print, and video, tracing connections between political and geological disasters in Lebanon and neighboring regions. His work has been exhibited really widely at key international venues. And when I was pulling together his bio, it was just way too long. It would take forever to go through it. So I don't do him, I do him a disservice here by only mentioning a few, but he's exhibited work at the Jameel Arts Center in Dubai, the Guggenheim in New York, MoMA in New York, the Jeu de Paume in Paris, the Tate in London, and his films have also been exhibited or shown at numerous international film festivals, where he's also won plenty of awards, such as the New Vision Award at the Copenhagen International Documentary Festival, the Best Director Award at the Dubai International Film Festival, and the Southern Panorama Award at Video Brazil. He's a recipient of Harvard's Robert E. Fulton Fellowship, the Rockefeller Foundation Award, and was recently invited as an artist in residence at the National Gallery in London. Panos Aprahamian is a writer, a video artist, and filmmaker based in Beirut. His practice explores ethnographic fictions, temporal disjunctions, non-human agency, lost futures, and live-action role play. He's an Arab Fund for Arts and Culture and Doha Film Institute grantee, and his work has been supported by Ashkal Alwan, the Middle East Media Initiative, Art Dubai, Beirut Art Center, and the Goethe Institute. He studied at the University of the Arts in London as a Caspian art scholar and at the Lebanese Academy of Fine Arts. He is also currently an instructor in fine arts and in media studies at the American University in Beirut, and he most recently was one of my colleagues in the department as well. So thank you both for joining me today. Maybe a good place to start our conversation is if we can talk briefly about what brought the three of us together. I mean, Panos and Ali, obviously you guys have a lot in common with the work that you do, but what does Islamic art and architecture have to do with the kinds of work that you're doing? The questions of heritage, the way that you approach them. So although the journal's readership is rather diverse, it's safe to say that the majority come from backgrounds like mine, working in the history and the practice of art, architecture, and urbanism in Islamic context. So my question for you is, as video artists and filmmakers and writers who are not directly engaged in debates within Islamic architectural history, what are your views on how film and video art, can lend our readership new perspectives on the complexity of heritage-related discourses? And either of you can get us started on that.
We can start with you, Ali, if you want. Prefer, yeah.
Okay, first, Hala, thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be having this conversation. The question, I was intrigued first when you invited me to do this under the title, the Islamic heritage or Islamic architecture, because my work doesn't tackle directly this question. But of course, taking some time to look back at this question, I think, you can directly see, the things that are points of interest in my work, which is related to heritage as a construct, as and there's nothing inherent in ruins. It's always something constructed, and how in my work I always try to decipher or look into how these constructs play a role, in oppression, in key moments in the history of the region, whether the colonial history or more recent with Arab nationalism, or what's happening in the Gulf. So all these questions, of course, then you can put the question of Islamic architecture or Islamic heritage, part of it, as just another one of the constructs, and how do these constructs can affect people, the writing of history, the production of knowledge as well. So that's how I saw, as a point of entry into the topic, but also, try to look at more specific examples. We were having just this conversation a bit before about what to talk about Anjar, and I was happy to find out that Panos is from Anjar. I didn't know that before. So thinking about this Islamic heritage site in Lebanon, which is an Umayyad site. It's a town with palaces and a mosque and housing complex. And how the history of this town, it's situated between Beirut and Damascus on the Damascus Road. What's called the Damascus Road, and it's a city that was built by Armenian refugees that came to the country in '39. So it's predominantly Christian Armenian town, and right next to another Sunni town, which is Barreliet. And of course, on this side, the question, there's a big dispute between these two towns on land and appropriation of land, and which was the key center of the tension behind it was actually Islamic heritage. That the claim of actually the Mufti of the Bika, which is located in Barreliet, claiming certain lands because these are of Islamic heritage. So for me, it was a very clear example how the question of heritage can and always is used as a hegemonic power in order to to use as a political tool to address a certain political situations and issues. What's interesting about this town is the dispute was actually all around a hill where there were some ruins, and they claimed that these were ruins of a mosque by the Mufti from Barreliet, and saying that we have to take over this hill and build again the mosque right in the middle of Anjar. And what was interesting is that the claim wasn't about the Umayyad side, which is clearly of Islamic heritage, and because the Umayyad, for the people who for the Lebanese, Anjar is not just a town; it has a very strong connotation, because it was the headquarters of the Syrian army during the Syrian occupation from '83 or '84 up to the assassination of the ex-prime minister Hariri in 2005. And the name of Anjar is always what's connotated with lots of violence. There was a detention center. There are people who disappeared, who died in this town, and there was also a mass grave that was discovered a few years ago in the town. And what's interesting is that the headquarters that the Syrian took, it overlooks the Umayyad site. and it was like a very, political stand, the saying, because the regime of Al-Assad has always claimed they died to be direct descendants of the Umayyads. So so the Sunni town didn't claim back this, like highly political site, but just a small ruins in order to take again more land from Anjar. So I just give this as an example. I mean, I think it's a case study to see how sometimes like these terms can have like some certain, can become political tools and even oppressive tools.
Yeah, and with everything that you're saying right now, I think for a lot of the people attending today and the people who will be watching this later, they don't think violence when they hear Anjar. They don't think, they don't think Syrian detention centers. They don't think these kinds of modern day conflict. Conflicts, even as, I mean, for us, a lot of us in the classroom, we teach Anjar as a sort of early palatial Islamic, Umayyad city. And even for a lot of us who live in Lebanon, we still think of Anjar as sort of this town filled with ruins. We don't think of it as kind of a living site. And we don't think about all these issues. And I think bringing you both in to talk about this kind of material is really what we're trying to get at with this dialogue series. And Panos, you have actually worked on a film related to Anjar, and we were just talking about it, and you said it has nothing to do with the ruins, that there were no ruins in your film. Can you weigh in on this a little bit? And you're muted.
Okay, so I think the main reason I had avoided the ruins was for visual reasons, because they kind of looked too different for like the film's sort of aesthetic consistency. I was kind of interested in that at that point, to have this sort of aesthetic mainframe that kind of is a continuum. Not so much with my later work. But also, I was kind of sort of focusing on the recent history of the town and the relationship between the refugees, the Armenian refugees who had arrived several decades, like almost half a century before, with the Syrian refugees who were arriving throughout like the last decade, and then also the different fears of the local Christian population that the civil war in Syria is going to spill over into Lebanon. And
this is because Anjar is so close to the Syrian border, right?
Because Anjar is only a few kilometers from the Syrian border. I don't know exactly how far from the actual like official border, but they are just like small mountains, hills that separate Anjar from Syria, and mountains that were also kind of used for by the Syrian opposition forces. And but coming back to what Ali is saying, I think even, I'm not 100% sure, but I think even the ruins themselves were used by the Syrian military and the military intelligence. Even some of the structures were used as detention centers, having like used to. So it's not only the town itself, but the ruins themselves have been subject to this sort of modern violence that was exerted by Syrian, like the Syrian Secret Service, and actually a lot of detainees were from these neighboring towns, especially like Majd al-Anjar, because of their relation to sort of like Muslim conservatism, and how this was seen as a threat to the Assad regime and its influence in Lebanon. On the other hand, what I found interesting in what you're saying is that it's not only on a national or a nation state level where ruins are used in order to create a sort of historical continuity and land claim, but this is on a very local level between different villages that each have, I suppose, few thousand or 5,000 inhabitants maximum. Yet they have this dispute over territory, and they're using sort of this religious or Islamic heritage as a claim over that, while in order to create this historical continuity that gives this geographic space uh, its belonging, which is usually what nation states do and have been doing since early modernity in order to create a sort of link between them and whoever inhabited this area in the past, which is, as we know, it's been used by nationalist movements all around and all the time. But this is a sort of difference, and I would like to hear more about it. As for the oh, and then like kind of the funny or ironic, I don't know, like thing about it is that the ruins were buried for such a long time. It was only in order to house the Armenian refugees there they started like digging and
Yeah.
cleaning the area and
You
have
have to
discovered the
when did
ruins.
it start to happen? Is there a date on
In the
this?
Yeah,
1940 days, I mean,
1940.
the site has been excavated, and it was excavated by an Armenian actually,
Hmm.
and which also some scholars, like I'm not an expert in archaeology, but that also some of the things that were reconstructed on the site were wrongly reconstructed, not according, to the architectural tradition during the Umayyads, but more like an Armenian, building techniques. So it's not a very correct site today. It's not like a very authentic. And also, of course, the ruins of the Umayyad, like ruins coming from Christian churches and Roman temples. So it's not like a pure Islamic site. I mean, it's like, again, the question of what is Islamic heritage or architecture.
It's actually interesting uh, how that returns like in the 20th century because they had used either remnants of Roman or Byzantine churches or I don't know structures, and then sort of this returns with these Armenians trying to rebuild what they found, but also it's not only the recent history of Anjar that is filled with sort of violence, history of violence, but rather like the very foundation of this town, the very modern foundation is this town, where was the French relocating these Armenian community from the Skanderun province because uh, it was annexed to Turkey, and the Armenians didn't want to stay there, and the very fact of like and they wanted to basically flatten the area in order to build a town, and this is sort of how the ruins were discovered, and then the violence returns again in the 90s and in the 80s and 90s, and then again very recently because you have Syrian refugee camps all around the area there. It's sort of an area with some constant conflict and sort of charged history.
Yeah, I mean, and what you guys are saying here, I mean, it gets back at, some questions that we were raising and discussing together over email before we even got to where we are right now. And we were just trying to work around, what do we mean? Ali, specifically, you're like, what do you mean by Islamic heritage here? Because you have this issue with how sometimes this can also be really kind of problematic, scope, and the notion reduces a very complicated social reality to this religious identity, right? And you said that Islamic heritage, Ali, said that it assumes that there's an inherent nature to what Islam is and what it's not, right? And so, I think what you're talking about here when it comes to Anjad, it really ties in to these ideas. And, the problems with the field as I see it, for instance, is that, despite its essentialist nature, this notion of Islamic heritage, there does seem to be a trend in scholarship, in some cases, where there's a distinction made between heritage that is classified as Islamic, and thus for Islamic art historians, this is worth saving and worth trying to save in some ways. And then there's a kind of heritage that falls beyond the interests of the realms of Islamic art historians. And I think a site like Anjar would be one that can, maybe at the surface be defined as Islamic. But there's also more complicated sites, right, in Syria and Iraq and in Artsakh in Armenia specifically, Do either of you want to, add to this a little bit before we move on?
What I
So,
think it's oh my god.
go
Okay,
ahead, go
so
ahead, go ahead, man.
what I think it's actually sort of this problematic nature of Islamic architecture, the definition of Islamic architecture, not only because other religious or cultural sites exist, but because Islamic architecture itself has these history of like different influences from like other pre-Islamic religions, like Zoroastrian, and also from Christian, like neighboring Christian cultures. And this is a problem for more than anyone is the Islamists themselves. That's why they have this sort of antagonism towards these structures, because for them Islam was supposed to be this sort of quotation or like revolutionary force that sort of erases the past, and they're looking
It's
towards
something
a
we all struggle with, definitely. I mean,
yeah.
it's something, it's always, for all Islamic art historians and architectural historians, there's always a few sessions devoted to, the problems of what do we mean when we say Islamic, and how do we address the cultures of non-Muslim minorities who played a large role, not just in the aesthetic conventions, but in actually producing a lot of this material that we are calling Islamic. And I mean, it's definitely a problem as a category in of itself that is heavily debated today. And I'm sure many of the people attending also have their own views on this. But maybe we can move on to the issue of violence. And I mean, you, Panos, you were saying how you're interested in how architecture and heritage can be weaponized. And I found that to be so strong and so astute a comment that it really got me thinking. I mean, you could see it in places like Armenia and maybe in Palestine most prevalently, right? And here we can bring in a discussion of film, right? I mean, how can some films that how can us looking at some films help us understand how the weaponization of architecture is sort of part and parcel of some discourses on heritage preservation? So specifically, you pointed to Atom Egoyan's calendar that came out in 1993, and Larissa Sansour's In the Future, They Ate from the Finest Porcelain, that film. So maybe we could start with the calendar and then talk about the other film.
Okay, so it's a film I highly recommend. Calendar is by Canadian Armenian filmmaker Atom Egoyan, and this is sort of a hybrid film. It's kind of autobiographical, but also mixed with fictional elements, and it's about a photographer who is sent by the Armenian community in Canada in order to take these portraits of these churches with his. So he goes with his wife because he doesn't speak Armenian, and she's sort of functions as his translator, and a local driver who is taking them around. Who is so him and his wife are played by themselves, but the driver is an Armenian actor. So right, it exists in this like hybrid place between documentary and fiction. And what's interesting for me is that the character throughout the photographer character seems to be in a way refusing to sort of approach the monuments, the heritage sites, and in a way it feels like it's because he just wants to get it done with and go back home because he sees it as a job. But I think there's a more interesting reading of that where he can only experience the sites through a sort of screen or mediation or photograph because of being in the diaspora, and his only relation to this is always an image rather than a reality, and experiencing them in a direct manner and not through the camera screen or the camera lens will sort of shatter this reality. And that's because and the film is called Calendar, and his mission was to take these photographs for calendars because that is a very a common thing to have in Armenian households, to have these calendars with images of Armenian churches, which are these like medieval churches, usually span from late antiquity to the early modern period. And they're sort of very much a foundation of the Armenian identity. And which is also used as a claim by Armenia and Armenians in order to claim or reclaim the territories that have been occupied or are in Turkey or Azerbaijan at the moment. And this is sort of a place of contention because, like we're talking before, this sort of historical construct of the nation state tries to, in a way, link between the present and the far past in order to, in a way, quote unquote, prove a historical continuity that this geographical place attaches the like the old inhabitants of the area to the new ones formed by the nation state. But of course, this is in itself a problem because only in modernity the nation state was seen as a sort of homogeneous entity with a specific identity, but this geographical area throughout time has been lived and populated by different people, and for most of it alongside each other. And then, so you have these monuments that, in a sense, acknowledge and double down on the fact that Armenians are claiming these territories, but also betray a historical a problem where it does like these regions were diverse and you might have churches but also other structures and other sort of ethnic, cultural and religious groups. And going to the other film, In the Future They Ate from the Finest Porcelain, so it is co-directed.
See
the trailer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Can you do that? Okay.
احنا عم نزرع بقائع في الأرض. في المستقبل لما علماء الآثار يكتشفوها رح تكون هي برهان على إنه هذا الشعب اللي احنا عم نطرحه اليوم كان موجود.
فإذا في المستقبل الناس رح تكتشف إنه حضارتك هاي أهلها كانوا يأكلوا من أرقى أنواع الخزف؟
مزبوط. وقتها بس القيامة ما بتصير في لحظة زمن.
Basically, this film is co-directed and written by Palestinian artist Leila Sansour, who is also playing the role of the voice, basically, of the interrogated militant, who is apprehended by the authorities because what she is trying to do is plant these porcelain artifacts because she is trying to create a future civilization on this very land. And in order to do that, she needs to sort of create for them a historical continuum from the present towards the future. So as she says in the trailer, she says, I'm doing this for the future archaeologists to find. And she, given that she's Palestinian and the recent history of Palestine and the foundation of the state of Israel, architecture and historical heritage were very much weaponized, probably way more even than Artsakh and places like that. And as we said before, there's this the nation state not only tries to lay claim over a geographic area, but also lay claim over the history of this geographic area in order to sort of claim to have been always here. But what's interesting in this film, and actually she is referred to as a narrative terrorist, the sort of the militant who is trying to plant these porcelain. And actually she uses porcelain and not terracotta or anything else because it's unique. Because she said, like, the civilization I want to invent made porcelain jars, sort of. So it's a sort of a bottom-up resistance against the meta-narrative created by nation state. So it is a form of a form of resistance. So it's not necessarily on the side of power where these narratives are created, but they're also used by the oppressed or the marginalized in order to kind of reclaim their homes, reclaim their identities, and sort of resist the assimilation or ethnic cleansing, etc. So even if you are looking at cultural heritage or architectural heritage, we tend to look at it from the side of power and how they're weaponized from one side, which is true. They do happen, like I said, throughout the world and throughout modernity, but also they are used by the other side, the side of the oppressed, as a form of resistance. And I think that's why this film is interesting. And you see it for a very short time in the trailer, but there's a shot where this young woman, this girl, is standing in front of a hole that's been digged on the floor, and you have several male figures surrounding her. And so one is in Ottoman military uniform. There are British colonial forces. There's another figure who kind of looks like an Arab nationalist. So you have this land that's been sort of, occupied or again and again by these different forces that have different narratives of the history of this place, and you can kind of have them all in one in one geographical and temporal space together. And this is why I specifically wanted to refer to this film, because of historical narratives and kind of the claim on heritage and how this can be used also by the side of the powerless or the underdog.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that comes back to some points that Ali was making in our earlier discussion by email, but also things that you want to talk about today. But I mean, I really like what you've raised, Panos, because it really illuminates to us how many stakeholders there are when it comes to the question of heritage. Heritage is something that is fluid; it's not fixed, and it's a matter of who's deciding what the heritage is, right? So in the case of the Armenian, in the case of Aton's film, you have the Armenian diaspora and their notion of heritage is, and then the Armenians living in Armenia, right? And then there's the occupational forces and the nationalist heritage that's trying to legitimize the presence of certain occupational forces, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in Artsakh. And then you have the other types of narratives that are nationalist in some way, but also tied to issues of tourism, as we're seeing, for instance, in the Gulf regions, right? Maybe one of the examples is Madain Saleh in the Hijaz region in Saudi Arabia today, that's being really, that connection to a pre-Islamic heritage is something that they're really pushing for in the UAE, in the northern part of the UAE, in Ras Al Khaimah, where they recently found Jewish tombstones that kind of happened at a time that coincided with the Israeli UAE agreements that took place, right, establishing the sense of legitimacy. And so in the case of Syria and Iraq, you have something going on that's also showing us the diverse approaches or the multifaceted aspect of heritage. And Ali, you've been thinking about issues like Syria, the role of ISIS, but also in Iraq, the way that the nationalist narrative has worked in the time of Saddam Hussein, for instance. Can you tell us more about
Yeah,
that?
I mean, just to also like continue a few words on Larissa's film. I think what's interesting is how, I mean, we know like with modernity how we moved, like from the mythical origin to the scientific origin. How the construct of the origin of a nation, and how what Larissa does in her film is like goes back to this complex relation of creating a myth for the scientific discovery in the future. So it's like she blurs again these, like this passage from the mythical to the scientific. I mean, and I think that this is what's been coming up. I think in our discussion is always the question of heritage is a contemporary question. It's never only or even a question about history. It's always about power forces who is capable of telling this story. So I mean, you mentioned I had put some slides also just like as a of Saddam Hussein, how he claimed, but like being direct descendant of the Akkadian kings and all the iconography that was used in Iraq, or like he even carved his, his head next to the Akkadian kings. So I mean, Arab nationalism and in general, like all authoritarian regimes in the region have used history and to legitimize their power, like as being the logical direct descendant, and so not to question their authority. But also, I mean, when you start like there was also in the beginning of the conflict in Syria, and all the question when ISIS started destroying, in Iraq and Mosul, and then in Tadmor, and how the first discourse was, all, we saw wave of, contestation against this, what's happening, as the losing, world heritage, and accusing Daesh of being responsible of this, of the destruction of world heritage. While if you don't look at the contemporary history, you miss understanding a few things. That, for instance, in Syria, we know that the first looting that was happening in Syrian towns were not by ISIS, were not by Daesh, but actually by local communities. It's the people who were actually going to archaeological sites and digging up and looting their own history, because of course, I mean, history for them was part of a of a regime. This is part of the apparatus of the Assad regime, and it was considered as an oppressive tool. So there's no, I mean, this kind of these regimes who wanted to create this kind of continuity in history actually created a rupture for the people who are living there as feeling as this doesn't belong to us. This is an image that the regime, this is like a discourse of the regime that is being imposed on us. So I think, and then of course later Daesh started took over the whole trade of antiquity, and at the same time also we know that a lot of also fake antiquity was being produced. We saw. I work a lot also on the market, in auction houses, and what happens when these pieces appear again on the legal market, but also on black market. And we know that there's a lot of, for instance, the Tadmor, busts that were appearing. And for me, I find it quite interesting that it was a time when in Syria, during the war in Syria, and also on the front front line between Turkey and Syria, that there were people producing these objects. I mean, it's, if you want to think of it, it's the people who are descendants of the people who built Tadmor are today producing or replicating the same gestures in order to produce a new artifact. And I think, I mean, for me, these objects are more signs, or at least this is, if you want, the archaeology of the Syrian war. These are, these are what the Syrian war also produced. These are, stemming from a contemporary moment, and for me, like they have a value not as being just replicas of, ancient objects, but also as being signs of the time of when they are being produced. So I'm always interested in these questions of history and how they collide with more contemporary questions and moments. And I wanted to put these two images, this image from the Mosul Museum from 2015, the Daesh destroying, the famous images, and that also created big controversy. Are they just like putting, a show, putting up a show, and the real artifacts were being, hidden to be sold on the black market? And of course, I mean, we know that Daesh uses this kind of the whole discourse of rupture with modernity, with modernity, is actually used as a way of as a propaganda in order to to of course they are part or a product of this modernity, but using the image of the discontinuity with this modernity, of creating a rupture with this modernity as a way of imposing their power, authority. And then in the next image that we see, it's from the National Museum in Beirut after the end of the civil war, the decasing of the sarcophagus that were in the National Museum, that were put in cement blocks in order to protect them. And I mean, I think it's these two parallel with these two images, and how heritage also produces images that stays in our head, just like the Mosul, the Daesh, the Mosul Museum. This other image, which stands at the right opposite, this is a moment of of revealing what has been protected, what has been safeguarded from the war, from violence. And the other moment is it's actually a moment of violence. This is actually part of the objects that were sold. I was following a group on Facebook who was regularly putting up things coming from Syria and selling them on Facebook. So these were some of the artifacts that were proposed to be sold. I think I'm not an expert, but I think these are they look fake. I think probably there are more experts can say if it is or not. And maybe going to the next slide just to remember which. Yeah, and just to end with this, I mean, of course, to go back, how of course history and the discourse of history is always used, like a political power. I mean, if you remember the concert that the Russian orchestra gave in Tadmur when ISIS was taken out of the site. And you could see, I mean, this was given also to a lot of the Syrian army soldiers who were part of the audience, as a form of triumph, and of course playing classic music, as being, like a higher value of humanity versus the savages of Daesh. So of course, I mean, all this just to say how all these discourses are being part of, being at play in Syria and during the Syrian war.
And then there's the your film, right?
Yeah.
The Digger.
Yeah, I mean,
you're into everything that we've been.
Yeah. So the Digger, just a few words about the Digger. The Digger is shot on a 5,000-year-old necropolis in the desert between Sharjah and Abu Dhabi, and actually a couple of sites in Jabal al-Buhis, Jabal Hafid, and it's mainly Jabal al-Buhis and Jabal Hafid. And it follows actually just the daily, the daily routine of Sultan Zaid Khan, which is the guardian of this site. That he's from Pakistan. He's been living for 20 years guarding this site. And this site actually is not, at the time, it wasn't even open for the tourists, because there's nothing really particular about it. There's mainly holes in the ground. These were burial sites that were dug up, and whatever was found there is actually in the National Museum, in the Archaeological Museum in Sharjah. And I was interested in this tension of this guardian figure who's protecting these empty holes that were emptied from whatever was there, but also of digging up the dead, of this, transgressive gesture of digging up the dead and putting them on display in the National Museum and building, the national narrative on top of the human remains. And what I was interested in, how, I mean, when I was talking to Sultan about his life in the desert, amongst these cemeteries, and how he was saying, like, how at night he sometimes hear voices. These are the souls of the dead people who were buried here, but he's not, afraid, because he's a good Muslim, so he knows that only the good ghosts or the good jinn would come and visit him. So, like, how his discourse brings back again, a certain reading of the site and of human remains, not as being archaeological objects for archaeological study or scientific study, but bring it back a theological, maybe, or like a reading, at least, of these ruins. So it was about this tension between the museum, where the discourse is being made, and the empty excavation site, with this Pakistani guard going every day and just keeping whatever left from the ruins from falling into ruins. And of course, like, how, I mean, these, I mean, we know, like, what's happening in the Gulf. There's a big hype of building museums, national museums, because these are still young nations, still in the process of, of writing their history, but also how the same nationalist narrative goes pair and pair next to very universalist, or at least wannabe universalist discourse that you could clearly see with the Louvre, Abu Dhabi, for instance, next to the Sheikh Zayed Museum on the Saadiyat Island in Abu Dhabi.
These are more images. And Panos, you too have dealt with similar ideas in relationship to ISIS, to destruction, to this question of whose heritage is this, and how it's an act of resistance to destroy the archaeological sites that were used for certain nationalist discourses.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So basically, given sort of how these looting or destruction of the sites are mediatized in our contemporary world, where the media focus is much more present and the sort of international outrage is much higher when these sites are destroyed or looted for ideological reasons, as opposed to transactional market, like black market reasons, and which is interesting for me, because their preservation is almost as much ideological as their destruction in this case, and in the case of ISIS or other Islamist movements, because the Taliban also destroyed Buddhist statues in Afghanistan. So also it plays on like a sort of a double historical or ideological playing field, where one is the very, like, the theological one, where anything that is sort of three-dimensional representation or whatever is sort of anathema for them, but also on the other one, kind of the more modern playing field will be, these were used by these very regimes, these secular military dictatorships that have repressed them and oppressed them for a long time. So it is also like it has this double reason for destruction. It's not only one or the other, and obviously in mainstream media, the second one, the one about these usage of by these oppressive regimes, is discarded. It comes down to radical Islam or not, or sort of more Western values of preservation versus these these savages again, like and yeah, and I just find it interesting then why the looting doesn't get so much press as much as the ideological battle does. And as we were saying before, right, there's the hegemonic power versus the resistance when it comes to sort of these historical narratives and preservation versus destruction, etc. But then you also have these modern enlightenment sort of ideological stance of like we do have to preserve these beyond like national reasons, but for I don't know, like humanist reasons, etc. And also you have this clashing with the destruction of the sites by organizations like ISIS versus the ones that are more local clashes between the hegemonic power, the nation state, and these groups who also reject very much these very nation states.
And you shared this slide with me, and I was wondering, how you were going to bring in a discussion of, and this is something that many of us use, when we're talking about the early, foundation of Baghdad. And I was interested in what you were thinking about when selecting this particular slide.
Two reasons. So, to be honest, the first one is that I just really like this illustration. And the second one is, it's not directly here, but sort of the destruction of the library, which alongside with the destruction of the library in Alexandria has this, creates again this myth where the imagination kind of creates how much we might have lost from this, and depending on different people and their interest, the amount of what is lost would reach to like different places, to like very extreme places on the other, which is something that I wanted to also bring out, like this sort of ideological battle in relation to heritage sites and archaeology, and is the sort of the conspiracy theorists who so like besides these nation states, the resistances, the hegemonic powers, etc., you also have this not so fringe anymore realm of like what is sort of called alternative archaeology. And what is interesting there for me is sort of what sort of historical continuity are these people wanting to have, right? These are usually people who are not even from these areas or these countries or these regions, but they are rather, in a way, they come in the sense, the same thing that you have in more mainstream politics or in mainstream media, where these reactionary populist right is rejecting the kind of fact-based mainstream scientific reality, but they're also doing the same with when it comes, there's this sort of struggle, this battle between mainstream archaeology and alternative archaeology, which sort of reflects this battle between the Trumps of the world and the centrist establishment politics. You have sort of the same dichotomy happening in archaeology or in art history. And this is, I just want to bring up, this is also as much of a question to you guys as much as me explaining about it, because I also am interested to know what you think about this, and if you have thought about this rivalry between these people, because they create completely different narratives of what history is, of what human history is. And then like Ali, you were saying, sort of the modern conception of these is the scientific one. So everyone tries to prove them scientifically in order to sort of lay claim on them or make them part of a certain narrative. Yet this is challenged by these forces. I mean, the reasons are diverse. I mean, there's also a lot of racism there because they're like, okay, these brown people in the global south, they can't build this on their own. It must be something supernatural. But then again, mainstream archaeology is as racist and colonial as the others. So we can move beyond that. Yeah, I mean, if any of you would like to share your thoughts on this.
Maybe Hala, you can.
Well, I was thinking, we're at 7 o'clock, and we could continue, or would you guys like to, open it up, because maybe others also might have an answer to your question. Panos, how would you guys? Because there's still a lot to show here, right? We want to talk about Ali's forthcoming project in Sudan, and I think it's and also talking to Panos about this notion of how archaeology or the notion of heritage can also be about ethnic cleansing, and so it's up to you guys. Do you guys want to continue, or should we open it up for questions?
Because I see there's already have been some questions
Yeah,
in
there's
the
already
chat,
some
so
questions.
we can
So maybe
start
we
addressing.
can. Well, first of all, maybe we can see if anybody has anything to add, or has a response for Panos, or maybe it's something that we can think about as we continue.
I know it's a very murky territory for historians. So yeah, I understand if anyone is reserved to answer this, but I mean there is a sort of battle happening there, and what do historians and archaeologists and sort of this academic community what to have, because it's like sort of the conspiracy theorists do point in a certain direction. I mean there is a problem that they're pointing at. I mean their conclusions are more often than not crazy and irrational, but there is a certain problematic there, a certain flaw, which is the very fact that these are as much based on national narratives and myths and etc. as they are on scientific research. So these people see this disjunction, let's say, and with the lack of sort of knowledge or ability to analyze and critique, they end up with these alternative facts, like they like to call it these days. So yeah, it is just something that it's interesting, and since we're having this conversation, I wanted to bring it up because we are always talking about this in the media and in electoral politics, in alternative media versus mainstream media, etc. But this also exists in history and archaeology, and I thought it's something.
Yeah.
I mean, no one. Yeah, go ahead.
No, just because you had mentioned Hala about how like the Islamic architecture or Islamic heritage, it's new that it's become like a something to study in academia. And I think it's interesting. I mean, to take heritage or history from a theological approach. I mean, looking at it from a theological approach, but also looking. I mean, because it's this again, this obsession. I mean, here because I was reading also Huda Ali Faris's question, like obsession with going back to the origin, that you have to build a theological, coming from theological perspective. There's a beginning and an end, and there's the linearity of time, but also, and I put like this quest. I mean, this interest in Islamic architecture or Islamic heritage as being something that we think religion is not concerned with materiality, but with the immaterial, with God. And then now we move to looking about tangible production of this religion. But I see it also part, I think, in humanities. Maybe better, like this whole interest now and revival of the question of materiality, and giving materiality agency, or like vibrant materiality. Like thinking about all the feminist philosophers, like Hannah Dunaway, Karen Barad, or Jane Bennett, all these philosophers thinking about agency in materiality, but that could also affect, the writing of history or the reading of history. It's not just, like a theoretical approach. And I see, this, because this, we're already at like a more shady gray area about being, like the scientific origin and like mythical origin. And already, I think in academia and the scientific community, things have become already more complex. And to see something, a term like Islamic heritage, I think it's symptomatic of this. I don't know if you can call it a turn in the study of history or in historiography, but at least it's something I've been observing. I'm not sure if like how to qualify it.
No, I definitely would agree with you guys that there's definitely it's something to be contended with, and we're still dealing very much with the sort of inherited ideas from the Enlightenment, and this notion of the scientific and the narratives. I mean, our history is literally just trying to break out of these chains, but in the end, what you end up with is like, so how do you talk about this material? Like for me as an instructor in class, how do I talk about Tadmur? Do I talk about its contemporary history? Do I talk about its history for ISIS? Do we even talk about ISIS because they're a terrorist organization? Should we even bring up this conversation in classes? And I think maybe for someone teaching in Lebanon, it's one thing, but for someone teaching in the US, it's a completely different thing that you do not want to be associated with. So it's whether we want to admit it or not, the contemporary politics impose themselves on how we decide what is a fact, and what is something that a narrative that we keep reproducing in our very courses only because it facilitates the process for us. And a lot of people, maybe choose not to address these complex issues because we don't they clash with the humanist approach. I think as well in some ways. This idea that we need to preserve a past for the future, for generations. And so there's something about this kind of violence that's not acceptable, but then another kind of violence that somewhat is acceptable in some ways. Like for instance, we didn't get to it, but there's this issue here with this Google arts and culture page that is now no longer present, but it was written about by Nevdon Jamogoshian in an article in Hyperallergic, where he accuses Google Arts and Culture of ethnic cleansing, having this page emerge right after the loss of territories in Artsakh, and relabeling this church as one connected to Albanian, thus Azerbaijani origins. He by calling it ethnic cleansing, I found that to be an extremely potent term to associate such a thing that could sometimes be seen as trivial, right? And and then Panos, I think you also might have something to say about this topic, or somewhat related to those tombstones that you shared images with, and then maybe we can get back to some of these questions because they're piling up. You're muted.
Yeah. So these tombstones are of Julfa in Nakhichevan, which is historically another contested area between the Azeris and the Armenians. It is no longer now because it is literally was fully ethnically cleansed from its Armenian population. So there are only Azeris now. I don't know if there are other ethnic groups, but it's part of Azerbaijan. It's an Azeri district. It is where the Aliyev family, the ruling family, are from. So there has been the destruction of this archaeological side, and it especially accelerated since the 90s. But also, I mean, there are some questions about film and video. This was only able to be documented from across the border, like from Armenians, because of the sort of availability of video cameras and zoom lenses, like recently. So, sort of how this is affected, how technology, how sort of the progress of time puts history into question. Because someone was asking about time, and it's that it's almost as if, not as if, it's almost it goes into this direction. Like the more time or modernity like move forward, the deeper history becomes. Right? If you look at how old the world was in sort of the general imaginary in the like late medieval period to the early modern period to now, it's like it's just becoming older and older. It's the same with the birth of agriculture, etc. And it is the same with these claims when it comes to the nation state, and in the case of Azerbaijan. So now going back to Artsakh, which is sort of the other side of the map, where Armenia and Azeri borders meet, where usually sort of the Azerbaijan's claim of heritage was either Islamic or Persian, or especially like Qajar, which is Turkic Persian heritage. But now they're going sort of deeper into the past and unearthing this kind of culture or this civilization, which is referred to as the Caucasian Albania, which has actually nothing to do with the European Albania. It is actually and it's actually an exonym. It's a name given by outsiders to this region. And even its Armenian name, which is Arvan, it's also a name given to them by Armenians. So we don't really know much about this culture. So it's a clean slate. It's like in a way a perfect culture to be used and to be exploited for national myth construction reasons, because we know so much of them. But if anything, kind of the closest we can get to sort of descendants of this culture are the Udi people and other like ethnic minorities within Azerbaijan and the Southern Caucasus. There's some of them live in Armenia and Georgia as well. There are a very small number of people. They are kind of thought of as the descendants of this Caucasian Albanians. Yet they are people who are completely colonized by, first and foremost, by Azerbaijan, but also by Armenia and Georgia. They're in Armenia, they're very much assimilated. They also have Armenian family names, etc. They do have their own language, but these people who are sort of forgotten completely, like from history, and are completely like live under full colonization, are now being their heritage is being used by one of the nation state in the region. In order to reinforce their national myth and their relationship to the deep past of this geographical region against another who they're also these people are also assimilated into, and yeah, so it's not only problematic because these are actually Armenian sites that are being rebranded as Christian Albanian sites, but the very descendants of the Christian Albanians are like disregarded from this history, like completely, because they're in a sort of their invisibility helps the Azeri state to create this continuity that is very homogeneous, that is very like I don't know. There's like this highway like into the deep past that is not sort of corrupted by these the presence of these other ethnic groups, of the fluidity of the diversity of the region, of the hybridity of identity of the nation, etc.
I mean, I guess what you're saying would actually tie in a little bit to some of the questions that we've been seeing. So Lawrence Chua And also, Elizabeth Rao had similar questions.
Mhm.
So they're asking about, how, as artists, what are some techniques that you use to interrogate or counter some of these imperialist or nationalist narratives, these dominant narratives that rely on the past remaining distinct from the lived present. Elizabeth adds to that by asking, um, you know, uh, she's curious about historical and artistic perspectives on imperialism and experiences of colonial time. Are there ways new media can repair or reimagine um, the past, present, and future, reimagine time?
Maybe like one of the, I mean, to go back to the practice, of making films or producing art related to question of heritage. Like I know for myself, like I'm not really interested in producing, counter narrative of the hegemonic narrative about history. And I don't think it's the role of the artist to do that, but rather more to complexify or to push to the limit where these whole constructs start falling or collapsing. So looking at ways of entry point to existing discourse in order to shake them or to make them less solid, and not actually producing producing just another discourse versus the discourse. I mean, and that's I think where I put the line between activism and art and producing art, and for me it's a very different role that art should play in this. And I think I'm interested in film because it's a medium that is always about temporality. I mean, moving image, it's producing image in time. And the question of how you manage time, for me at least, is directly related, about the experience of time. I mean, when you look at ruins, for instance, what you see first. I mean, we know there's a very long tradition, of ruin gazing, or producing poetry or painting, or all this of the ruins, because these are not about a specific history, but about it's like going to the essence of time. It's an experience of what time is, and I think I treat making films or making moving images in this sense of of thinking about time and producing a representation of this question on a timeline.
Yeah, I think Ali made a good point there, where sort of the temporality or the time-based nature of film and video can sort of recreate or reproduce this very experience that one has with a ruin in the present, right? Because and I guess as academics, you are besides the sort of the narrative about the like national narratives and the hegemonic powers, you are more interested in what in the history of these ruins, but very much what are ruins as experienced in the present, right? And not just for cultural, national, or religious reasons, but just as these objects, these materials that modern humans or non-humans or whoever would come across with, and how are their experience today. And we are always, even when it comes to the scientific approach, we are always projecting our current perspective onto this past, right? I don't know. It's like it's sort of a sort of running joke for archaeologists when archaeologists don't figure out what a site is for. They would just say it's for ritual. Because it's like, oh yeah, it's for and
all figurine are Venuses and
yeah. And while we completely disregard what was important for these people, their relationship to the site they're in, their relationship to the world at that point was like very different from and now. So in a way, I'm interested in the sort of the present time and how high ruins or heritage sites are perceived now, and what does that mean? And also going beyond the political or the ideological, but just the existential dimension. I did want to say something also. It slipped my mind.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Huda asked a couple of questions. He said, why do you think there exists today this obsession with archiving, excavating, preserving history? And how do you think this trend will contribute to our present and future cultural production? So,
Yeah,
I mean,
I think it's an interesting.
Yeah, I mean,
it's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's like it's now there's a like particular obsession that maybe these practices are becoming more visible. But if I want to like read this as a, like something happening now with this, like archiving, excavating, and preserving history, I see it's more I mean, it's related to the present moment we live. I mean, for me, it's like symptomatic of the present moment.
Frankfurt am Main Hauptbahnhof über Heidelberg. Abfahrt 18:04. Heute von Gleis 9.
Maybe it's the video playing again.
Can someone mute?
Nach Frankfurt am Main Hauptbahnhof über Heidelberg. Abfahrt 18:04. Heute von Gleis 9.
I can't. Whoever has their mic open.
Information on NEC 112 to Frankfurt Central via Heidelberg. Departure 18:04. Today from platform 9. I repeat, NEC 112 to Frankfurt Central.
Hala, you can mute everyone because you're the host.
04. Today from platform.
You have the ability to mute everyone.
Okay,
was that successful?
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. So I was saying, I mean, about. It's the spirit.
Okay.
Talking to us, yeah. I was just to answer Huda's question. For me, it's more like signs or like symptoms of of an anxious presence, and this whole like drive of going back to history and archive and collecting and all this is more for me signs of an anxious present and more actually condensation of time. It's not an interest in the past or the future, but more about how we have to deal every day and negotiate every day. I mean, with overcoming the catastrophes of the past, and in a way also trying to avoid the catastrophe of the future. I mean, living in Beirut today, it's like a perfect example how every time you're living in the present moment, and then because like you're in such a dense and intense present that keeps doesn't give you even the time to write history or like create a chronology, and it seems like just a succession of ruptures. But at the same time, also when you look at like in a larger scale, this cyclical time of the disaster, of the catastrophe that keeps coming back. I mean, the Lebanese people quite unfortunately very knowledgeable with this situation. So yeah, so I did it more like anxiety of a present rather than interest in past and future.
Yeah, like to answer. Actually, I remember what I want to say, but this will also answer the question here. But also like going back to the idea of hybridity and then how art can help history adapt to this. Well, right, because and then going into the question of archiving and documentation, because right when it comes to the usage of media or of like photography or land-based media is like, or like the application or like reproducible image, is that on one side you have the documentation and archiving, on the other one you have artifice or fabrication, which also reflects what is happening on an ideological hegemonic structural level. And I think no medium or genre or discipline more than like contemporary media arts moves back and forth between like documentation and archiving on one side and artifice and fabrication on the other, as much as like with such ease and fluidity. I mean, it is very much ingrained in its inception, right? So and then you have even genres like named now as like hybrid cinema or parafiction or the essay, like or the video essay, the film essay, etc. And I think in that sense, maybe contemporary video art and media arts and experimental filmmaking can help bridge this divide and like kind of put new things into question and into problematic. Is just this very ability, the ease it moves from documentation to artifice and then back and forth. And maybe so, but as I said, it's not necessarily the place for the artist to do that, but the medium itself having this fluidity and again, as I was saying, the idea of like giving agency to matter, and then maybe like as a form of media, it is helpful in a way to jump back and forth between these things, because even the sort of the scientific minded or the sort of scientific research, the academic research, it is based on a narrative at the end. You two have to have to tell a story. And you tell a factual scientific story or a mythical story, you are telling a story at the end of the day. And I guess one can learn from that, because even images that we take for granted as factual or documentary images, like images of outer space, of galaxies and nebula, etc. Those are always photographed black and white by the telescopes, by these agencies, and they are colored by artists. Actually, there's always the artist's rendering of like coloring these images. But in the popular imaginary, these are actual images of space, but they're actually colored by artists, and those are supposedly scientific images that which should be different than cultural or artistic images, but they're actually kind of doing the same thing. So maybe thinking about all of these different things and how also science and academia are also based on a certain aesthetic, because it isn't also an aesthetic question there, and maybe this can help sort of put things into perspective. Because Karsten here was asking, so as an archaeologist, the potential of art to help us transcend intellectual borders imposed by academia is of immense value. So maybe to think of academia and the sciences, whether social or natural, as also aesthetic practices, at least to a certain extent. I mean, it has different disciplines and overlapping things in there, but it are also as much an aesthetic practice as anything else, really. I don't know if you guys agree, but you can. I think that's a way to look at it.
I mean, we're out of time, but maybe we can take this one more question, because we had a few technical issues, and I think we ate like 3 minutes of our time. So maybe we can take one more question if anybody has from the audience.
Also, maybe did we miss any question? Because
there's a new message.
Ali's film on Sudan.
Oh, also, Bonnie is asking if they can contact us. Of course. I mean, yes. In my case, if Ali.
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Okay.
But I guess we can finish up with a quick discussion of Ali's film in progress. I mean, the reason why we had this conversation now, we were meant to have it a few weeks later, was because Ali's traveling to Sudan after tomorrow. So if you can we'll round off with your.
Yeah. I mean, I try to be quick. I mean, the film is called The Dam, and it's on the Marawi Dam. For the people who know, it's one of the hydroelectric projects that are on the Nile River. So you have the Aswan Dam in Egypt, Marawi Dam in Sudan, northern Sudan, and apparently there's the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia that is that is being built. And of course, I mean, as all dam building, it's a site of violence. I mean, there are people who, like more than 50,000 people who had to leave their, historical lands, and this is the land of the Black Pharaohs, the Nubian desert. And people actually refused to leave their houses. So the government, what they did in 2008, they opened the water gates, and they sent the water and inundated the villages before even people could, before they had left their towns, and people could barely save anything that was there. So the film is about this territory of violence. I mean, in my work, I work a lot with how violence can translate or have material manifestation in things, even on people, in body, in movement, but also in the landscape. And looking at landscape as as a site of reading violence. Of course, this is coming from being born in the beginning of the civil war, living in the civil war in Lebanon. The question of ruins of the narrative, how you can tell it also narrated a traumatic experience. So just a couple of words. This image we see these are the Nubian pyramids in Sudan. They have actually more pyramids than in Egypt. And all these pyramids, if you notice, all the tip of the pyramids are broken because in 1890, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not sure of the date, but an Italian gold hunter put dynamite and exploded all the pyramids in the Marawi site in Sudan in order to look for gold. And it's just as an anecdote, I mean, even till today, I mean, the Italians are the one who, tourism, like when I go to visit this site, the only place where you could stay, it's run by an Italian company who's still taking advantage of this historical site after, historically being the ones who destroyed it. But the film is not about this. It's about something else and about landscape of violence. So yeah, I'm leaving a couple of days to finish shooting the film. So hopefully I'll be able to do that and show it soon.